The tension in the room was unbearable. The grand piano stood in the center like a silent witness to what was about to unfold. The air was thick with judgment, the kind that made it hard to breathe. Seated before the polished black and white keys was Mr. Thomas Williams, an elderly man with silver hair, deep wrinkles that told stories of a lifetime, and eyes that had seen far too much. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of the moment. Across from him stood Miss Carter, the strictest and most feared piano instructor at Wellington Academy, a prestigious institution that prided itself on discipline, tradition, and, though they would never admit it aloud, exclusivity. Her sharp blue eyes bore into him with a look of superiority. Her arms were crossed tightly, her stance rigid. She wasn't just a teacher, she was a gatekeeper, ensuring that only the right kind of students thrived under her guidance. And in her mind, Mr. Williams did not belong here. "Go on," she said coldly, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at the piano. "Play." The room wasn't empty. A handful of students and faculty members stood in the background, their expressions ranging from mild curiosity to outright disdain. They were not here for a performance. They were here to watch him fail. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss stories like this. This one, you won't believe how it ends. Mr. Williams took a deep breath. He wasn't new to humiliation. Life had a way of throwing him into situations like these. But this was different. It wasn't just about him. It was about what he represented. Let's rewind. A few weeks earlier, Wellington Academy had announced a special cultural program, inviting members of the community to participate in select classes as a way to bridge the generational gap. On paper, it was a noble idea. In reality, it was a publicity stunt, a way for the academy to appear progressive without actually changing anything. Mr. Williams had been excited. Music had always been his passion. As a young man, he had dreamed of becoming a pianist, but life had other plans. Opportunities were rare for someone like him in the past. And now, decades later, he finally had a chance to step into a world that had once been closed off to him. But from the moment he arrived, it was clear that not everyone welcomed his presence. Ms. Carter had made her disapproval known immediately. She never said it outright, but her actions spoke volumes. She ignored his questions in class. She corrected his posture with unnecessary force. And when he played, no matter how well, she always found something wrong. "You hold your hands too stiffly. Your rhythm is off. You don't have the proper training." It didn't matter what he did. She never gave him a chance. The other students followed her lead. Whispers filled the hallways when he passed by. Snickers echoed whenever he made a mistake. No one expected him to last. But he refused to quit. Until today. Today, Ms. Carter had arranged for a special evaluation. In front of her class, in front of faculty, in front of everyone who doubted him, she had called him to the piano. Not to uplift him. Not to encourage him. But to humiliate him. "Play," she repeated, tapping her foot impatiently. Mr. Williams adjusted his posture. His fingers hovered above the keys. The silence in the room was suffocating. He could feel their eyes on him. Waiting. Expecting failure. Then, he began to play. And what happened next, no one saw coming. The first notes rang out, soft yet deliberate. A simple melody, elegant in its restraint. At first, the audience remained indifferent, expecting the shaky, hesitant playing of an untrained amateur. But then, something changed. Mr. Williams' hands, once still and uncertain, came to life. His fingers glided across the keys with the precision of someone who had lived and breathed music for decades. The melody, once restrained, blossomed into something extraordinary. Ms. Carter's smirk faltered. The students who had been whispering among themselves fell silent. The faculty members exchanged glances, unsure of what they were witnessing. Because this was not the performance of a struggling novice. This was artistry. Each note carried emotion, years of struggle, of passion, of a dream long denied. The melody swelled, filling the grand hall with something more than just sound. It was a story, a statement, a defiance against every expectation placed upon him. And suddenly, it was them who felt out of place. Ms. Carter took a step forward, her fingers tightening into fists. This wasn't supposed to happen. She had set him up to fail, to prove that he didn't belong. But now, in front of everyone, he was proving something else entirely. He belonged here. No. More than that. He dominated this space. But she couldn't let that stand. Stop, she snapped. Mr. Williams didn't react. He was lost in the music, his eyes closed, his face serene. For the first time in years, he was truly free. I said stop. A sharp slam echoed through the room as Ms. Carter brought her hand down onto the piano lid, cutting off the sound. The abrupt silence was deafening. Mr. Williams opened his eyes, his hands still hovering over the keys. His breathing was steady. He didn't look surprised, he had known this moment was coming. You are disrupting the class, Ms. Carter said, her voice laced with barely concealed frustration. This is a structured environment, not some street performance. A murmur rippled through the room. Some of the students shifted uncomfortably. They had expected an embarrassing failure, not an act of pure talent being silenced. Mr. Williams slowly turned his gaze toward her. And for the first time, it was she who felt small. You asked me to play, he said, his voice calm. So I played. Ms. Carter's face darkened. That was not playing. That was noise. The tension in the air thickened. She was grasping for control, but it was slipping through her fingers. And then, a single voice broke through the silence. That wasn't noise. All eyes turned to the source. It was a student, a young man seated near the front, his face conflicted. He hesitated before continuing, but his words came firm. That was incredible. A ripple of agreement passed through the room. Another student nodded. I've never heard anything like that before. Ms. Carter's jaw tightened. This was spiraling out of control. Enough, she said through gritted teeth. This is my classroom. And I decide what is acceptable. She turned back to Mr. Williams, a cold finality in her stare. You will leave. Now. A heavy silence followed. The moment hung in the air, waiting for something, waiting for someone to take a stand. And then. A clap. One student. Then another. Then another. Applause grew, hesitant at first, then stronger. Some students rose from their seats. Even a few faculty members, those who had initially stood in passive observation, joined in. Ms. Carter's expression collapsed into disbelief. Mr. Williams didn't move. He simply sat there, absorbing the moment. And then, with quiet dignity, he stood up. He gave one last look to Ms. Carter. And he smiled. Not a smile of defiance. But a smile of victory. The applause filled the room, echoing off the grand walls of Wellington Academy's music hall. Ms. Carter stood frozen, her face a mixture of disbelief and fury. This was supposed to be her moment of control, her way of proving that Mr. Williams did not belong. But now, the very students she had trained to uphold the Academy's rigid standards were applauding the man she tried to humiliate. Mr. Williams took a step back from the piano, letting the sound of appreciation wash over him. It wasn't just about him, it was about everything he represented. A lifetime of closed doors. A career that never was. A talent ignored. And yet, here he stood, not as a failure, but as someone who had just commanded the entire room with nothing but his music. Ms. Carter turned sharply toward the students, her voice cutting through the applause. "That's enough," she barked. "This is not how we conduct ourselves in this institution." The clapping faltered, but it didn't stop entirely. She turned back to Mr. Williams, her jaw tight. "I will not tolerate this display. You are here as a guest, and it's clear that this environment is not suited for you. I suggest you leave." Silence. Then, from the back of the room, another voice spoke. "No. He stays." It was Professor Andrews, the head of the music department. A respected figure at the academy, he had remained quiet through the ordeal, observing, studying. But now, he stepped forward, his gaze locked onto Ms. Carter. "I've taught at Wellington for 20 years, he continued, his voice measured. "And in all that time, I've never seen a performance like the one I just witnessed." Ms. Carter stiffened. "With all due respect, Professor, this is my class. I determine the curriculum, and you used your authority to humiliate a man who did nothing but embrace music," he interrupted, his voice carrying a weight that silenced the room. "Tell me, Ms. Carter, was that your lesson today? Was that what Wellington Academy stands for?" A heavy pause. Ms. Carter's lips pressed into a thin line, but she had no answer. Professor Andrews turned to Mr. Williams. "Sir, may I ask, where did you learn to play like that?" Mr. Williams exhaled slowly. "I taught myself. When I was young, I wanted to study music, but," he let the sentence hang, knowing he didn't need to explain. Professor Andrews nodded. "Then, in my professional opinion, you are not a student in this class. You are a musician. And I would be honored if you would consider playing for our advanced students in a masterclass." Gasps rippled through the audience. Ms. Carter's face paled. "You can't be serious." "I am very serious," Professor Andrews replied. "And if you have any objections, you are free to take it up with the board." Ms. Carter opened her mouth to argue, but she knew. The moment she turned this into a battle with Professor Andrews, she had lost. The students were still watching. The faculty was still present. She had exposed herself, not just as a strict teacher, but as something far worse. Without another word, she turned on her heel and stormed out of the room. The silence she left behind was thick with tension. Then, a single voice broke through once more. "Mr. Williams?" He turned. It was the student who had spoken earlier, the first one to acknowledge his talent. "Would you play another one?" Mr. Williams smiled. Not a smile of victory, but of something deeper. A smile of belonging. He returned to the piano, his fingers resting gently on the keys. And then, he played. This time, the room wasn't watching out of curiosity. They were watching out of respect. And Ms. Carter? She would never be able to erase this moment. Final message and call to action. This story is a powerful reminder that talent knows no boundaries. It doesn't belong to a single age, race, or institution, it belongs to those who dare to embrace it, no matter who tries to stand in their way. What do you think? Do you believe Ms. Carter got what she deserved? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss another powerful tale. Until next time.